Hey, it's Patrick Regan here from Kintsugi Hope. Welcome to the big debate on justice, mental health and poverty. We are so grateful for you taking some of your time out to discuss these really massive issues. And so thank you so much. Now, if we were doing this live, I'd be telling you where the toilets and the fire exits are, but I'm guessing that you're good with that, that you probably know that already. And but just to let you know, there's going to be a series of talks. There's going to be some interviews. There's going to be some panel discussion, and then a closing talk around 10 to 9. If you want to ask questions, you can ask questions at any time on the live chat, which is on YouTube. Please get your questions in there. It will be absolutely brilliant to be able to answer some of those. Just to also let you know, on the YouTube description, there's a whole host of resources there. If there's some situations which you're struggling with, or you know people that are struggling, there's websites, there's all sorts of information there as well. And also just let you know about some resources. This is a book that I've written called On the Scale of Silence. It's okay not to be okay, but especially helpful for people at the moment who are going through a hard time with their emotional and mental health. So do check that out. That would be brilliant. And also one of our panelists, Rachel Newham, who's amazing. She's written a book called Learning to Breathe, My Journey with Mental Illness. And I'm sure if you Google that, you'll be able to find that somewhere as well. We're also going to be doing live tweeting throughout the night. So if you go to #TheBigDebate, you will basically be able to join with everyone else there. Tonight is brought to you by two organisations, Kintsugi Hope and CAP, Christians Against Poverty. Now, I'm the CEO of Kintsugi, and some people say to me, what on earth does that mean? And Kintsugi is basically a Japanese word that means golden joinery. If you get a bowl and you break it, normally what we would do is we'd mend it with super glue, and we try and hide the cracks. What they do in Japan is basically they put a gold powder in the glue. So instead of hiding the cracks, they make a feature of the cracks. Arguably, the object becomes more beautiful for being broken. I firmly believe that beauty can come out of brokenness, and our scars are not there to be ashamed. They're part of our journey. And so what we did, me and my wife, Diane, we set up this charity a couple of years ago, and we're really trying to help people in two areas, mental health and social isolation, which are huge today, aren't they? And we did it. It's really simple, by running a 12-week program similar to Alcoholics Anonymous, but about well-being. So you may go to the gym, though it's hard to do that now, to invest in your physical health, or go for a cycle or run. And this is all about investing in your mental health. So we look at subjects like anxiety and self-acceptance and resilience and perfectionism, all written in learning styles. We train churches and charities to run these in communities, and hundreds of people, literally hundreds of people. And we're signing up different charity church every single day. It's been incredible. We've got to have more honest conversations about this stuff. You know, Brené Brown says this, the research professor, we are living in the most medicated, obese, addicted cohort in history. Not being honest isn't working for us. But you know what? You can only be honest, really, if you feel safe and supported and you feel like you're not going to be judged all the time. And so this is a really short video looking at a little bit of me and my friend Hannah talking about Kintsugi. Check this out.
My youngest son, Nathaniel, was at a friend's house. There was a confrontation with a boy that turned up and decided that he'd take a knife and stab Nathaniel with it. I feel like at that time I was in a bubble and feeling alone and not even knowing how to articulate that to anyone.
I had to have major limb reconstruction surgery. Around the same time, my daughter got a condition called HSP and my dad got cancer. It was like a perfect storm of things going wrong. And I realised that the anxiety was really taking root in my life. And then you realise that actually you can't just carry on. And you need to show some self-compassion.
Bereavement is different for everyone. What's really important is that people are able to talk to someone that they can connect with. And through that, there's a real good healing process.
And actually maybe receiving help is letting go of your pride and saying, I am really broken. And as we share in our brokenness, we share in our common humanity.
The brokenness is my heart, and it's in pieces. But through time, it's starting to come together again.
So do get in touch with some of the links below on the screen. Just to frame tonight's debate, the recent acknowledgement by the United Nations that the COVID-19 epidemic is causing absolutely wide psychological distress. The UN revealed last year that a person dies by suicide every 40 seconds, and yet governments spend less than 1% of their budgets on mental health care. The lockdown relating to COVID-19 will create a tsunami of mental health problems, as well as accelerating mental health problems that already exist. And we know that you are twice as more likely to die from COVID-19 if you're living in a community that struggles with high levels of deprivation. And there's been so many reports out. Another really important report today came out looking at the effect of COVID-19 on the Black, Asian, minority and ethnic community. I believe we've got to look at these issues through the lens of justice. Someone once said this: justice is what love looks like in public. We need justice. And, and obviously at the moment, people are crying out for justice. The unjust killing of George Floyd in the States has caused so much pain, so much heartache. We need to realize there's going to be no vaccine available for the effects of COVID-19 on mental health and poverty. We've got to grapple with these issues now. We need to look at what is the government's response, but also what is our response as communities and individuals. I've often said you cannot legislate for relationships. So what we're going to do is we're going to start by watching a short film that explaining the effect of COVID-19, not just here, but around the globe, and what could start to happen in these issues around poverty and mental health when lockdown starts to ease. Then after the video, my friend Nina Hussain will introduce our guests and take us through the evening. Nina presents the ITV Lunchtime News and ITV's weekly coronavirus Q&A program. We're so pleased and she's here hosting us this evening. So check out this video and then Nina will introduce our first guest.
While countries around the world continue to mobilize to contain the spread of COVID-19, mental health experts say we can't lose sight of an equally alarming issue: the long-term mental health impact the pandemic is going to leave on society.
What I think we're facing here is a very traumatic event for a lot of people. It's a traumatic societal event for people. And one thing that we know about trauma is that while it's happening, you do whatever you can do to survive. You bear down and you just get through it, which is what we're all trying to do right now. I think that we're still very much in the trauma phase, the active trauma phase of this pandemic.
But what happens after physical distancing measures are lifted? What comes after the pandemic is over and people are able to get back to whatever their normal may be?
There's going to be residual stress, depression, certainly financial pressures, learning how to re-engage with the world in this new way. That's going to be difficult for a lot of people, and those are exactly the kinds of risk factors that lead to increasing rates of depression, anxiety, and even suicide.
The rapid spread of the pandemic gave little chance to prepare for or even process all that has happened in terms of job losses and the complete uprooting of everyday life and relationships. Hennick says for those already suffering from anxiety and depression, the pandemic could be exacerbating their symptoms. He is also concerned for those who have never suffered from any mental health issues in the past and are now facing a life disruption without fully digesting the long-term impact this may have on them. A large body of scientific studies show that there is a close relationship between indicators such as unemployment, mental health, and suicide. Research out of the Great Recession of 2008 reveals that a 1% increase in unemployment was accompanied by a 1% increase in the rates of suicides in the US. Hennick explains there is a peak and a valley response in our nervous system when faced with trauma. Right now, we are at a peak in which we are engaging with the immediate threat of the pandemic. You go into survival mode, which can be very taxing on a person's mental health.
And in fact, it doesn't actually let you think through or process what's happening to you. Its only interest is in keeping you alive and keeping you safe.
Once the pandemic is over, there will be a valley in which we recover from that threat. But the problem is, going back to baseline without support can take a lot longer than we may think. After the threat passes, Hennick says people can start to retreat or fall into depression or find many other ways of dissociating themselves with the trauma they experienced.
It can really become almost an infection on its own. Some people stay stuck either way at the top of that peak, or they stay stuck down at the bottom, or anywhere in between. Not everybody returns to baseline, and that's where we become concerned about mental illness.
We currently have universal medical care, but things like psychotherapy, which Hennig says has proven to be an effective treatment for mental health problems, generally isn't funded publicly. Hennig says the federal and provincial governments need to step up to make sure proper treatments and programs are funded, so as many people as possible have access when in need, adding that everyone, including employers, will have to play a role.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for giving up your time this evening on such a sunny evening to discuss such vital issues and problems that we've got ahead of us in the middle of this health emergency that we're all experiencing to some extent right now. My first guest tonight, we've only got him for a little bit because he could be called off to vote in the Commons any minute. So let me introduce you to the former leader of the Conservative Party and the current chair of the Centre for Social Justice. If you've got any questions for Sir Ian Duncan-Smith, I suggest you get them in right now while he's giving you a short talk, and then I can put them to him before he heads off to vote. So Sir Ian, welcome, and over to you.
Nina, thank you very much indeed. My apologies in advance, but the vote is coming slightly earlier than I expected, so I will stay here as long as I possibly can until we vote. Can I thank, first of all, Patrick for this opportunity, and also for all the work, Patrick, that you've done over the years, from XLP right the way through to this incredible work that you're doing on mental health, particularly for young people. I think we do need to give you a huge, potential, silent round of applause because your dedication is inspiring. The Centre for Social Justice I set up, and which is really how I got to know Patrick, was really looking at a whole series of the causes of poverty. Yes, of course, the single biggest cause is money, absence of money, but it's really what leads families and people into the state where they're unable to negotiate their lives to such an extent that then they fall into poverty. And we came up with 5 and then modified pathways, we called them. One was, Patrick referred to it earlier on, which was family dysfunction and breakdown. The other was educational failure, that is achieving lower than you should possibly have achieved during the educational process. Addictions, we do alcohol and drugs, obviously, but we've also added gambling, and I'm a vice chairman of the all-party parliamentary group on online harms, which is growing in this particular COVID period, which is a really big and often unsung problem for people and affects their mental health. Worklessness, all connected, and debt. And in that comes a justice part that we're now running, looking at the nature of the criminal justice system with regards to how it interacts with those in the lowest 5 to 10% of the economy. And the mental health side runs all the way through there too. And as you probably noticed from those pathways, they all interact with each other. Family breakdown, we know, leads to things like addictions. In many cases, often worklessness, debt. Debt leads to family breakdown. Educational failure can lead to debt. Debt to family breakdown. You can see how the circle feeds off each other, and therefore looking this as a group of pathways, we hope to be able to break down some of the issues and problems. There's no question we are doing work at the moment at the centre on what has happened in COVID. Patrick referred again to some of these aspects to it, and we're looking across the board at how did families fare during COVID, what were the strengths that came out of COVID, what were the things that we exposed about the way we live our lives, which allow us to shine a light on the things that have gone wrong. Strong families coming together, supporting each other, helping their neighbours, helping others, has been a feature of a lot of this. But then where those don't exist, where that process of breakdown has been, you can see what is there to help and support and replace that. And there's no question that being isolated has definitely affected people's sense of themselves, their sense of well-being, and their mental health. And one of the things we're very, very keen to work on, and we will work, Patrick, with you and your organisation on this, is to try and see how we can overcome that process and what government can do more, A, to recognise, which they have done to a great degree, but there's more to be done, to recognise the real pressure that comes on people and their mental health suffers dramatically and what we can do to both, first of all, highlight that as a critical area in the health system, and also at the same time to understand how these breakdowns, these dysfunctional family life and often poor community relationships often can affect people's well-being and their ability, therefore, to work through that process and the justice system itself. So that's what the Centre for Social Justice engaged in. We hope to be able to publish that process, that report, in the coming few weeks after we come out of lockdown, and that analysis, I hope, will spark a particular debate. But yes, it is absolutely critical that social justice remains at the heart of everything that we do in government, that we test all that we do against it. As you said earlier on, Patrick, that the issue of relationships cannot be legislated for. But in truth, I think it can in a way. I think one of the biggest problems we face in this country is a refusal of politicians to recognize the importance, structural importance of family life. And to not just to say we will direct people what to do, but I do think we are so uneasy about talking about it that we fail to recognize that actually alone, amongst many other countries, we give less support to families that want to stay together, that want to support each other. We do less than most other countries do to support counselling when there's problems and issues. We don't recognise the connection too often between debt and family breakdown. One of the biggest causes of family breakdown, if you talk to those who work in counselling, will tell you that at the end of it all, often it's a breakdown in trust that comes through debt and problems through debt and what causes that. And so I think we do need to do much more to underline and strengthen that process of family ties, which can then create neighbourhoods and communities around them. So I do believe it's a critical part of it. I celebrate the work that you do. There's much more we can do, but I hope this COVID outbreak will be the beginning of a real opportunity to re-examine the things that are good about what we do and the things that aren't so good and that we need to change.
Sirian, thank you for that. Patrick started by saying that there is we know there's no vaccine yet for COVID, but there's definitely no vaccine and won't be for the mental health crisis that comes beyond this physical health emergency. A question from somebody watching right now to you: what measures are being implemented for mental health provision during this pandemic? I appreciate your research is going on and you're looking into the mental health impact, but is the government taking the mental health impact seriously and then putting in the funding in the future for when we are faced with this myriad of problems caused by this pandemic?
Yes, the government does recognise it, as I understand it. There has been now more money applied to mental health treatment. There is yet planned for more. Of course, in the midst of COVID, where the direct attack is on the physical health, that, of course, absorbed a huge amount of the attention of government for the first couple of months. You can obviously understand why. But as we've come through that and we're now beginning to look at the longer period of lockdown, and as we unlock, I was talking to the Prime Minister the other day, and I did make this point to him that we now need to recognise that there will be real issues around mental health. And whatever our plans were before COVID, we'll need to upscale those plans at the treatment end of things in the NHS and to highlight the need for this. And much greater work, for example, on the talking therapies, which are huge in overcoming anxiety and depression, which I think we don't, again, recognise enough, that it is possible to treat these conditions and early, because they're the biggest influx of mental health problems that come into the health service are hugely due to depression and anxiety, and they can be got at early and treated, and therefore we should be doing more of that early on. But there will be more and more support.
Sure. The problem is that even before this COVID crisis, people were finding it hard to access those talking therapies, weren't they?
Yep. There's no question. As I say, the emphasis now must be on that. We must get more people trained to be able to work in the talking therapies area, because this is a very early and one of, you could argue, one of the easiest areas for us to apply in the treatment side of things, definitely. So you'll find in our reports, as we bring them out, we will be stressing the need for government to massively upscale that.
Did Boris Johnson take your, sorry to interrupt, Ian, yeah. I know we're short of time. Did Boris Johnson take your your call seriously? Because obviously he's a man fighting many a fire at the moment with many priorities, the health emergency and the economic situation as well. Did he take your call seriously that mental health has to be prioritised at some point?
He does, actually, and even more so since his own serious COVID outbreak, as it were, that rendered him very close to death, really, in a way. I think he understands the stresses that come through this COVID outbreak, and I think he was quite open with me that he really understands now what is needed, I think. And I think the whole issue around the health service and structuring and restructuring it so that we actually focus it now on those kind of conditions that we can treat very early on and get to very early on is very important. And I got the sense that he understood that. Matt Hancock, I've had the same conversation with him, and he says exactly right. We've got to really, really move on this very fast. And I hope and believe that they will, and I'm certainly going to be chasing them.
Okay, former Work and Pensions Secretary, a question for you here. Can we have some review, a question from a viewer, of the universal credit system so that those who are struggling already can access funds more quickly and perhaps earn more before they get penalised or need recalculation? I mean, the amount of people, the extra people already claiming universal credit, and one presumes there will be many more to come in the next few weeks and months ahead.
Well, there are two strands to this answer. The first one is that, let's be very clear about universal credit as a structure. It has met an incredible challenge. I mean, it's put on over 2 million people in the space of about 6 weeks, which I honestly tell you, before, the original systems that were grouped and very complex would have collapsed. They used to collapse pretty much the whole time. This has not collapsed. What they have done is they stripped out some of the areas that may have caused difficulty, and I've talked at length to them about that. So they're already talking now about what they do. Any early advances, they're not calling on them to be repaid at this particular point. They will deal with that afterwards, and we'll look at how that works. I'm not there, but that was one of my recommendations. The second thing is they have prioritized getting money to people. So about 95% of those who have needed payments have got payments absolutely on time, and I think there's a staggering number of advances, over 700,000 advances have been paid, and paid very quickly and very early. So the system itself is capable of delivering, and it has proved that it's structurally very sound. Now, you're dealing with policy here, and policy is about how you recognize what the structure was meant for. When I designed universal credit, did not design it to have 6 or even 5 weeks delay. It was designed at first instance to have 4 weeks, with the option available for a 2-week payment if they need it. And that is how it should work. And I believe the government will review that after we come out of this to make sure that that is possibly implemented. Certainly you can fall after the first payment to a 2-weekly payment. That's a policy matter. It's not something that universal credit can't cope with. It's a matter of policy for government, and I've recommended they should do that. And on the debt side of things, one of the big problems about universal credit has been there was huge amounts, billions and billions of debt on tax credits, which was never claimed, and the government then kind of parked it. When universal credit was launched, what the government did, the HMRC, is dumped the debt back on people's shoulders as they went into universal credit. And so universal credit began to be used as a debt reclaimment process. I was absolutely adamant that should not be the case. I have argued with the government, get rid of that debt. That debt has nothing to do with universal credit. It was on the back of real problems with tax credits that should never have been moved across. And so we are arguing very strongly for that. And the third area is that alongside universal credit was always meant to be a thing called universal support, which was where if somebody had a problem or a difficulty with debt, with addictions, could be mental health, you were able immediately to move them onto a group or a program that would help them with that condition. That has never been fully rolled out alongside universal credit. So that would allow universal credit to identify those with problems and move them into treatment, which was the whole idea, so that you start helping people to move away from their problems. And that I'm arguing, and you will see that in our report, that we need to roll that out.
That was my question. So you will push for that once that report has come out, because if there ever was a need for what you've just described, it is now, isn't it? Another question here. We know that school holidays and closures affect children and young people who receive free school meals, and that charities step in to provide during the holidays. How can this be done in terms of supporting the mental health of children and young people who miss out on mental health care through mentoring and teachers' input when schools are closed? Look, we know so many of the at-risk children, the vulnerable children, haven't been attending school during this period when the schools were open for key workers and at-risk children. I mean, this is a crisis of itself, isn't it? What can be done?
Well, I think what COVID has I think, shone a light on is that children that are at risk clearly for a reason. So if you take everybody out of school and then say, oh, by the way, we'll take the at-risk kids, then these are the children that are least likely to attend school anyway. So a lot of them went missing. Why? Because often they may be part of very dysfunctional families, families with real problems. There could be abuse going on, all sorts of things. So without that imperative for them to go to school, they just disappeared off the map, as it were. It's literally going to be a really important piece of research to figure out the damage that has been done on those kids for not being at school in a safe environment during the period of the COVID lockdown. One of the areas really where we do need to examine how we interrelate children and their schools who are at risk, and what we can do to ensure ourselves that at all times they are covered. And that was an area that I think surprised everybody, and perhaps it shouldn't have done. But I do think we need to do much more on that in support of them. And actually really looking at how we deal with children like that in the after school time, that is to say in holidays, etc. One of the great ideas that we've been trying to promote through the Centre for Social Justice is the on-side system. There's a fantastic man called John Roberts who owns and runs AO, and he started across the Northwest these youth centres, but they're not youth centres like you've seen before. Children join them. He has thousands and thousands that go in each of these. They have full of activities in them. They're both professionally run. They have counselling in them, everything. I want those rolled out into every single area. We've asked the government for extra money. They haven't given us extra money. We need more. But if we had one of those or two of those in every single borough, this is exactly how you'll be able to reach some of the most damaged children and be able to help them. And that is a big plan of ours to try and get that done.
Serene, I'm sorry, I just missed the gentleman's name that you just mentioned.
John Roberts, who is the owner, runs AO, the big white goods distribution company. He's a great philanthropist, but also a man who has a real vision about running youth centres in an efficient way, like you run businesses, that have private money and public money associated, and have local boards made up of local people looking after them. And that really works. There's about 15 of them open. There's more opening now, beginning to open in London. And wherever they go, you see a fall in crime, and you see real help on mental health. And I think they are absolutely brilliant. And I'd love to show anybody around them if they get the chance. It's a vision.
Do you think Sorry to interrupt. Do you think the government should have done more to make sure there was a consistent approach to trying to get the vulnerable children back into school? Because it was dependent on, in some areas, on teachers, some areas on social workers, some areas none of that chasing up really of the adults, of the parents happened, which has led in part to primary schools being reopened to a lot more pupils now to get some of those vulnerable children back. Could the government have done more? Should it have done more early on, as soon as we knew so many children weren't going to school?
Well, I think a huge amount of this relies on local authorities, and this is one of the areas that there are two big areas that we've exposed in this. This is one, which is who takes responsibility for ensuring that these children go to where they're meant to go at this time. And this was good in some areas, not so good in other areas.
But in a national crisis, surely it should be the national government. We've never lived through times like this.
Well, yes, the national government wants it to happen, but the national government doesn't have the mechanisms to do that. They work through local authorities for this. So the question is, how do you organize local authorities and schools, therefore, to be able to ensure that they take these kids and ensure they get there? Been one of the areas. It started to improve, but now we've gone back out of lockdown. The other area, by the way, this exposes is the care system as well. Again, separated from the health service, but massively linked to the health service. And this is one of the areas we want to look at very carefully to figure out whether it is high time that the health service and the care system were locked together, because the pressure on the health system is often down to the failures of the care system in different local authority areas, and we need to sort that out. So both these are areas that are now we begin to shine a light on, and we may yet be able to do something very positive about this as we come out of COVID.
Okay, some potential good news there. Lots of comments about the need for food banks, the higher need for food banks right now, and the long-term impact that this has had on people who are using food banks up and down the country. We know already, again, before this crisis, their use had massively increased, and this situation, for understandable reasons, has made it worse.
Yes. food banks have grown in the UK, and lots of different reasons why that is the case, and the use of food banks. Food bank was never really a cultural issue in the UK. If you look at a place like Germany, for example, they have food banks as part of their welfare system. They nationalize them. They serve about 1.5 million people a week, so they are on a much bigger scale. Food banks here have been set up voluntarily, and it's obviously clearly a good thing. The pressure here since COVID has hugely gone to people who are isolated, those who are most at risk. At the time, I was with one of the food banks quite recently where we were trying to get Costco to help us produce all the food containers that would go for heated food. And they relied massively and actually successfully on stores and supermarkets to help them. But it's really them that have been supplying those at-risk homes where people have not been allowed out. The elderly, those with comorbidities that would be under great risk if they were to get in contact with coronavirus. This bit has actually worked pretty well under the local authorities. They have managed to garner together the food banks and to work centrally and to help give them the addresses and the support that's necessary. And as a result of that, yes, they've been supplying more, and supermarkets and others have also been supplying them with more food. So there is some positive out of this, which is, yes, they're meeting a need, but I think a lot of the community has come together to help that, I think, which is, again, a positive, but obviously we need to figure out how we go forward with that.
Yeah, food banks are one charitable provision in this country. There's a lot of comments on my phone from people listening about their concerns about the lack of charity donations right now. I know the government has given some support, I think £750 million to help all charities. Do you think that's going to be anywhere near enough? Because so many charities are reporting that they're really struggling right now, and so much of the work that the government does is reliant on these support agencies, volunteers, helping people with everything that they struggle with, where the government doesn't help them. They fill in the gaps. Are you concerned about how these charities survive, and then what impact that will have on all the people that they help?
Yes, I right at the beginning, we made the case to the government for extra support to the charitable sector, because the big problem is charitable sector, as you will know, relies hugely on support from trusts and others. We recognized quite early on that trust funds, because of the collapse in the markets when we locked down and when the rest of the world locked down, it meant that they were not donating what they would have done for the very simple reason they didn't have the money coming into the trust funds, and the trust funds therefore weren't earning what they should have earned. One trust fund I know saw their income collapse by $1.5 million in 1 week. So this did affect them, but we managed to persuade the government to give them that 750. We asked for just under $1 billion, but I've always maintained that this is a stopgap for the moment, and we have to see how long this takes us before those trusts start to build up again and what the government needs to do. So it isn't the case the government said that's it. The government has said they're going to give them this money, which they have, and they'll keep this under review and see where the charitable sector lies over the coming weeks. And this is one of the areas that we're urging them now to review again on the prospects for the economy, because we're much later coming out of lockdown than was originally intended. So that 750 million was planned to cover fewer weeks than it's having to cover at the moment. So one of the areas we're going to have to get the government to do is probably to support them further until we can get clear and the economy moving again.
When were we due to come out of lockdown?
Well, originally, of course, there was talk about 4 or 5 weeks in lockdown. It was going to be hugely about supporting the health service and then essentially getting control of this and moving out. But as we saw going further down the road, this took longer. It's the same with most other countries. It took longer to come through this than people had anticipated, so the lockdown stayed. So as I say, early on, the early money was to cover what was originally, I think, intended to be maybe 5 or 6, at most 7 weeks in lockdown. We're now being 10 weeks in lockdown, and so we will be reviewing that, and it's one of the areas we're talking to the government about.
Yeah, because obviously we've seen the furlough scheme extended, which will help individuals, but obviously the charitable sector presumably needs that help extended too. There's a question here about whether the government will be putting in additional funding to social services. We've seen obviously the pandemic in care homes and the real focus on what social services do try to do in this country. If we're heading into a recession, which most economists are predicting for this country and countries across the world, it's very hard to see where that money will come from, and any talk of joining health and social care together properly, again, will that be off the table now? It's concerning
no,
times.
there is going to be extra money for social care. There's already been extra money put into social care. As we come out of this, we do need to have a serious root and branch rethink about how we deliver social care. It's verging on the dysfunctional in the sense that it's run by local authorities, but it's hugely impacts on the health service. Therefore, you need to somehow find the link between the health service and social care much stronger. We also saw during this outbreak that there was a real difficulty to coordinate different ends of the social care sector. We found that various agencies, carers were travelling between care homes within certain groups, which had not been spotted early on, which was one of the reasons why you had this transmission increase. Interestingly, for what it's worth, all over Europe, almost every country ended up with the same problem, which is an outbreak of coronavirus in their care system. I think Germany, it accounted for 50% of the deaths. In most other countries, it was around the same. So every country, no matter how good they've had it, they just didn't kind of grip this early on and put it right. And I think we therefore need to do a serious rethink of it. But that is definitely coming down the tracks. So one of the areas the government has prioritised is going to be a big structural reform, and we need to get cross-party support on that. No longer can we allow this to be a debating tool between different parties. We need to kind of learn from coronavirus, come together on these core issues and agree what we think needs to happen after a proper report and put the funding into it. Can I also say that I can see all my colleagues going through the voting lobbies at the moment. So you will forgive me.
Can I ask you one more question then, Sir Ian? I just wanted your thoughts really on the fact that there's pretty much been a double whammy this week for anyone in an ethnic minority community. We've seen the scenes, 7 days of protests in America and across the world in light of George Floyd's death. We've also seen today Public Health England finally release its report into COVID deaths within ethnic minority communities. No recommendations for how to protect people within those communities. It's a tough time to be somebody from a Black or Asian background heritage at the moment. Is that going to be looked at by the government when we're out of this?
Yes, I think it's a rolling issue and a rolling problem that has to be kept under constant review. There is no question in my mind that there are issues that are here in the UK. I don't think we face quite the same challenges of the United States, in the sense I think that I dare say it, I think we're better in that relationship. It doesn't mean to say there aren't problems. There are problems and issues, but the government has already recognised that. It's only a week since that terrible death, unjustified death. But notwithstanding that, it is something we do need to keep under review. We need to recognise that different parts of society, for various reasons, don't fare as well as others, and they may not be to do with their abilities, but more to do with the condition of their lives and their families and the structure of the way they live their lives. These things are important, I think. So, yeah, it's definitely something I would favour.
Yeah, this pandemic has clearly shone a light on those inequalities that were already there. So, Ian Duncan-Smith, thank you very much for joining us tonight. Head off to join the very long socially distanced queue, I hope. And thank you very much for giving up your time this evening and answering so many of those questions from people watching.
Thanks. And again, I apologise to all those listening. Apologies to all those listening, but I'm called by bells at the moment, so my apologies. Thank you.
Thank you, Sir Ian. My next guest is Rachel Newham. She is the founder of the mental health charity Think Twice. And as Patrick mentioned, let's give the book another plug, author of Learning to Breathe. Rachel, thank you so much for joining us as well. Good evening to you.
Hi.
We've discussed some of the issues there with Ian Duncan-Smith, but from your experiences of running this charity, people must be telling you of the strain that this pandemic is putting on their mental health at the moment.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that is about this pandemic, that it's stripped away everybody's coping mechanisms. So I think people who have been living with mental illness for even a few years or even a few months, have kind of built ways to deal with it. So seeing friends or keeping active or whatever that is. and all of a sudden that's not there anymore. And so trying to find new ways in which to support their own mental health, whilst the support has changed so drastically, has been really difficult. And I think it's exacerbating all the wider anxieties about the state of the world, I guess, a little bit, and means that people just, I think, are feeling extra anxious on top of kind of whatever they're facing, because the support that they rely on is even harder to access than normal.
Yeah, and that's really difficult for anybody in lockdown, somebody living in a tower block, somebody who hasn't got access to a garden in the strictest lockdown regime that we were under. But it's really, really difficult for those people who have lost somebody and haven't got that normal support network. We've seen countless stories of that. Even new mums who are giving birth, who may suffer postnatal depression, but again haven't got that normal support network to call on before the problems exacerbate into something clinically serious. I mean, it's a desperately worrying time for so many people, isn't it?
Yes, definitely. And I think one of the most important things when it comes to dealing with mental health issues is early intervention. We see that again and again, that actually when problems are tackled early enough, when people are given perhaps kind of community support early enough, actually it means that they don't have to go into secondary care. They don't have to end up in hospital or end up with really severe cases of mental illnesses like postnatal depression. And so the fact that actually all that early community stuff isn't being able to be done is a real worry. And I think we're going to have a real challenge in the whole country actually learning to manage the grief of this time, whether it be that people have lost a loved one and horrendous times where they've had to say goodbye over FaceTime, but also, I guess, on a more general level, just the normal life that actually isn't happening. And we as a community, as a society, are going to have to learn how to process and to grieve, the last 3 months.
Yeah, absolutely. And the next stage, the stage we're in now, the social distancing stage, I think it takes a toll on people in ways that we wouldn't quite imagine. And I think it's something as human beings we've never experienced. And again, presumably, as you say, in terms of people's normal coping mechanisms, thrust into this strange new world, are really being tested in ways that we would have never imagined we would have ever had to do.
Yeah, and I think certainly from the people that I'm speaking to, one of the main things that people are facing is the anxiety. And anxiety in and of itself is normal and natural, but actually it's all the everyday interactions that people have been doing for years and years and years, whether it be going to the shop or whatever, but thinking, oh, actually, am I a bit too close? Oh, somebody brushed past me. What does this mean for me? What does this mean for my family? And it means that even as we ease out of lockdown, it means that actually people are possibly even more anxious now at the easing of the lockdown than they were when everyone was inside, because there was a sense of you had a bit of control over what was happening in your own space. Whereas now, we're going out a bit more into the world and we rely a lot more on other people, I guess, following the guidelines.
Yeah, and we're seeing, aren't we, pictures of people clearly not doing that, hearing stories about key people not doing that, and I think that adds to the general anxiety. How do you think COVID-19 has highlighted the inequalities regarding mental health and poverty that already, as we know, existed?
I think it has just been really eye-opening. I saw somewhere on social media that we're all in the same storm, but we're certainly not all in the same boat. And actually, it is that the difference between somebody who has access to outside space, so their own garden or outside space, to somebody who is in a tower block and unable to get out, or in somebody who is shielding and isn't even able to go into their own garden because there are other people there. I think we are seeing that everything is put under a microscope. We're seeing that actually we have far greater inequalities in our world than we thought we did. I think we like to think that actually we're a bit better than that, perhaps in the UK, but we're seeing that ultimately the poorer you are, the worse your outcomes are. I was reading a report today and saying actually, it's the lowest 20% wage earners who are suffering the most from COVID. They're experiencing the greater ill effects of the disease, and I think it needs to I guess give us a bit of a shock that actually, if we're going to tackle the mental health crisis, we need to tackle the inequality that goes alongside that as well.
Yeah, and we've had the stories, haven't we, of in terms of the lack of consistency with education. Because if you are at home and you have got a laptop and you've got a teacher that's streaming lessons versus children living in a large family, there's perhaps one smartphone for the whole family. The children are trying to crowd around that to get any semblance of education. That's really impossible. And then when we think about what might happen in the future, and you've got companies like Twitter saying all our workers are free to work from home forever, we're doing a different model here, and you soon realize that if you are living in a shared very small flat with other people with rubbish Wi-Fi, that's not going to be an option for you to enter a new workforce in the year or so to come, where if you are from a very a much richer background where you've got access to all that modern technology easily and the space to create an office in your own home. So in the future it's going to damage those people even further. I mean, it's problems that we haven't even thought about yet, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. And I think kind of going back to the issue, particularly of children and young people, it is very much that actually those who are being able to be supported, perhaps they have a wider range of resources to use at home, as opposed to children and young people who don't have access to internet in the same way. We think of it very much as natural as running water almost nowadays, but actually everyone's relying on it more. And so if you have a lesser package, lesser broadband package, then actually your education's going to suffer. I think it's certainly highlighted to me that school is a great leveler in that sense, that everyone can go in and access the same materials within. Obviously there are variations, but actually there is there's pens and paper, and there's the access to teaching.
Yeah, and that's gone at the moment. From your own experience of being admitted to an adult mental health ward when you were just 16, are you concerned about teenagers or younger children not getting the access to right help at the moment, given the social distancing, given the strain on all health services?
Yes, I think in the 14 years or whatever it was since I was 16, nothing's improved. Arguably, actually, the amount of young people who are having to access mental health services has increased dramatically. We talk about this age of anxiety we're living in. We know that the child and adolescent mental health services are hugely overburdened, and that's before now. That's before COVID, and so it does really concern me that actually children and young people might get put on the waiting list. But again and again, what I've been hearing over the last year or two is that children and young people have to wait until they get to the point where they are suicidal or have made an attempt on their own life in order to access the help that they really need. And I can't actually think of any other illness that happens in. And I think it's one of the really clear markers that actually mental health stigma is a justice issue, because we see people turned away from services that are meant to help them because there's no capacity, simply because they're not ill enough. And I think there needs to be a rethinking of the way that's done, but also, I guess, a push and encouragement for charities and other services to be able to kind of fill in those gaps as well, and because we know that their waiting lists are really long as well.
Rachel, I'm going to bring you back for the panel with we'll put some questions from viewers just to leave on a more positive note. Anyone watching, and we know hundreds of people joined us at the beginning of this, if they want some practical advice about how to help people with mental health problems who are living in poverty right now, what can you suggest?
I think one of the things is to point them towards resources they may not know about. So things like the prescription prepayment schemes. So actually, they don't have to pay the full price. They can get paid by direct debit every month, so that they pay a less price regardless of how many medications they're having to do. So actually, a kind of on a monetary value. Getting involved in local coronavirus support groups, which are happening kind of locally all over the country, that are providing, shopping for people who are shielding and self-isolating, but also providing that emotional and mental health support that people so desperately need.
Okay, Rachel, thank you very much for your sage words. And join me a little later if you will. Thank you for that. Before we hear from our next guest, who is the CEO of Christians Against Poverty, CAP, here's a short film that tells the story of Tina, a CAP client during lockdown.
Hi, I'm Rachel from the External Affairs team here at Christians Against Poverty. You don't need me to tell you that right now life looks very, very different for all of us. But at CAP, we know how difficult life can be for people living on low incomes and in vulnerable circumstances at the best of times, and living in lockdown presents additional challenges. The relationships we're able to build with our clients gives us an insight into what a lot of people are dealing with right now. And so we filmed some videos so you can hear directly from our clients about what this experience has been like for them. This video is from Tina, a former CAP client who you might remember from a video they accompanied our Stacked Against report last year. Tina is now debt-free, but still has a range of health conditions that make daily activities difficult and often painful, including a crumbling hip, fibromyalgia, ME, post-traumatic stress disorder, and clinical depression. We caught up with Tina from her home during lockdown, and this is what she wanted to share with you.
Lockdown for me has been very difficult because of my mental health. I rely on seeing people and going to my mental health appointments and things like that. I self-isolated myself because of underlying medical problems in the beginning and would only go out to do shopping. But I went into one shop and I picked up my shopping, really glad that I got 99% of it in one shop. I'd queued up to get in the store, queued up and walked round, did the queuing up in the tills. Got to the till, she put it all through. I went to pay and she refused my cash. Now, because of what I went through in the past, I only use cash. Don't keep money in my bank to pay shopping because I find it easier to use cash. I know exactly how much I've spent, everything. She then totally refused. I was on a bad day anyway, and she had the audacity to ask me to then put the shopping away back on the shelf because I couldn't pay for it. I walked out the shop in tears. I was then got very, very ill and 99% certain that I have had COVID. So obviously I've had to isolate myself then even more. People are doing deliveries of fruit and veg and meat, but it's designed for 2, 3, 4 people. Or if they do one, it's a minimum order. So I'm one of these that's in the middle. I'm being forgotten, if you know what I mean. I live on benefits. I live on disability benefits. As far as money goes, I'm okay, but I am spending more than what I would normally. I've learned how to do my topping up my gas and electric online, which was something I was like, I'm never going to be able to do that. I have a couple of, like my old debt coach and everyone, that she phones me up once a week. How are you doing? Is there anything we can do? A 5-minute conversation can get someone through a week. Because I've said it so many times when I've done things for CAP or whatever, you don't know what's going on behind closed doors. I hope and pray that we never have to go through anything like this again.
Well, I'm delighted to say that I'm now joined by CAP CEO Paula Stringer. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. But we don't know where we're heading in terms of the economic situation ahead of us, but it is predicted that a lot of people could lose their jobs. We could see the worst recession that any of us will have experienced. You and your family have had personal experience of having a business go bust. The impact on you was devastating. Can you just talk us through what happened to you, what the business was, and what impact that had?
Well, it was honestly one of the most difficult things that my family has ever gone through. So my husband and I, we owned and ran a local business where we lived. It was a deli, coffee shop and restaurant, and I actually worked as well at the BBC. Thankfully, I had another job. Dan ran the business, and it was doing brilliantly well. For a few years, we ran the business and realised that we got to the point where we needed to expand, or actually we kind of hit a limit in where we were going to go with the business. So we went to the bank and said, this is the business plan, would you support us if we expanded the business? And they said, we love the business. They knew us. It was actually when banks were on the high street, and said, yes, we love the business. We will support this. Agree with the business plan. Not a problem. So we expanded the business, but we knew we were going to have about 3 years where we were financially quite tight. And for the first year, everything actually went really well. We hit all of our markers on the business plan, and we thought, okay, we're going to be okay. But what we did not realise was that the recession that had hit a couple of years earlier would hit the high street very hard a couple of years later. And on top of that, a very well-known coffee shop that I shan't name and shame, opened up round the corner after saying that they wouldn't come to Marple because there wasn't a coffee culture a few years before, decided that there then was. And those two things together basically just diminished our business to the point where we couldn't pay rent or couldn't pay down a salary. And within about 9 months, our business was just on the floor. We ended up closing the business, letting all of our staff go. And my husband, Dan, who was running the business at the time, absolutely retreated into himself. It was a desperate time. We ended up going through bankruptcy. And we had creditors that were banging on our door that we were friends at one point, and then we obviously owed them money, and we lived locally because we supported the local businesses. Dan basically couldn't even go out of the house for a significant amount of time and ended up having a breakdown. And I can honestly say that it was one of the most shameful times. We were filled with guilt and shame and felt judged. And it took everything within us to hold it together and get through that for both of us, because I never expected that financial difficulty could impact us in such a significant way. Now, I say this, and let me put some context around this. We actually had an income still coming in because I still worked. We had friends and family that still supported us and loved us, and a church family as well. We were surrounded by support. I'm not saying that everyone was supportive, because there were some difficult things and some tough conversations and horrible phone calls, as I say. But essentially, we had significant amounts of support, and yet we found it almost impossible. And Dan couldn't work for an entire year because it affected him so badly. And the bottom line is, it took us, and Dan in particular, a few years to recover. And we realised that the impact that it had on us, who had all of this other stuff, if you like, the support around us, if it impacted us like that, then we knew that people who had significantly less than that, this was unbelievably devastating. Which is ultimately why I ended up leaving the BBC and joining Christians Against Poverty, because we wanted to try and make a difference to people that this really impacted.
Paula, I think there's a Costa in Marple, just saying, as an aside.
Who am I to say, Nina? Who am I to say?
There might be, last time I was there anyway. In terms of the work with CAP, and the experience you've had, including Dan having suicidal thoughts at the darkest of times, you've talked about feeling desperate, which I think a lot of people could sympathise and empathise with. You talked about the shame that you felt as well. In the role that you are in now, and presumably you've analysed why you felt that shame. How do you help people try to avoid that element of the financial problems that were life-changing at the time?
For other people, you mean, Nina, when in terms of how we deal with them?
Yeah, in terms of to try to help people not lose themselves in the shame. Is there a way of is that something that you talk about with people?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that's high on our agenda because, we already know that it takes usually an average of 3 years before someone will even pick up the phone to admit they've got a problem. And normally they've buried that problem for years and they literally just piling up letters and stuff like that. And they are terribly, terribly ashamed of. And you talk to anyone in poverty, they don't talk about the material issues that they've got, almost like the financial issues. They talk about it in terms of humility, just all of the kind of like judgment and all of those other negative words, not the material things. So what we actually do, and this is the unique part of our service, is that we offer a face-to-face in-person service working with the local church. So there is a really where they need it. And when that debt coach actually walks into someone's house, obviously at the moment it's socially distanced, we're doing it by the phone and video for now, but when they actually walk into their house, they have someone that is absolutely deliberately and non-judgmental, and any client that you talk to would say exactly that same thing. We couldn't believe, they literally just we lifted a weight, and there was never, no matter what we'd done, no matter how we got into that situation, they just understood and said, okay, we will find a way to help you. And that is one of the critical things about what we do, and that's why the face-to-face bit works even better for those particularly vulnerable people.
And in terms of anybody who's working right now, say a key worker who's working very hard but not fearful of losing their job in what could happen in the future, how can people, especially anybody watching, help those who are potentially on the brink thinking, I'm furloughed at the moment, or I'm self-employed and I'm getting government help, but the self-employment help is running out in August and the furlough is running out in October, and then my life has gone from this to this, as it happened to you, where pretty much overnight in a very short period of time you were bankrupt.
So I think what's really interesting at the moment is we've seen an increase in calls across the sector, but not as much as one would expect. And the reason is because we're in this lull before the storm, and you can see a tsunami coming towards you of poverty and of mental health illness, because everyone is just going, I'm not quite sure yet how this is going to impact me because I don't know whether I'm going to lose my job. And so therefore, obviously people will want to wait and see where they land. But what I will say is, if you end up in a situation where you lose your job, or you are concerned about your finances, please don't wait. Don't hide the letters, and don't think that you can, it'll sort itself out. It is much better. The earlier you will get intervention, the more you are saved, not only financially, but also in terms of your mental health. Those two things go hand in hand. More than half of the clients that come to us state that it's the second biggest reason people actually get into financial difficulties, and over half of those people who are sort of in debt say that it exacerbates their mental health illness. So they've got to come. The sooner you come, the better, and the faster you will get out of that situation, and you won't end up spiraling down.
It's a key message, isn't it? But it's so hard to make that first phone call, to make that first request for help.
That is the hardest bit. Yeah.
So often. Just before I bring in our next guest and put questions to all of you, to end on a positive note, what was the turning point for Dan?
Well, we ended up with having someone take us through the bankruptcy process. And this was, again, really interesting because, Dan and I, one could argue that we are reasonably intelligent. But, we actually found it. We didn't understand how to do it and what we're doing, because particularly for Dan, when you are in that kind of situation and your mental health has deteriorated, you cannot process information properly, and you can't actually do things that you would normally be able to do. So we ended up having someone kindly literally walk us through that process. And so when we came out of that in itself helped to lift Dan up, knowing that we got some support. So support there was important, but actually the ultimate thing that really worked for Dan is he couldn't work full-time. He couldn't cope with the stress of a full-time job. They describe it as having a glass that's full. His was literally teetering on full. Even normal things could tip him over the edge because he was already operating up here. And we found a job for him. It was a part-time job working for the National Trust at a place called Lyme Park, which is not very far away from where we live. And it was the most beautiful place. And he ended up in an administrative post in their estate office, sort of relatively stress-free, and was able to just spend some time, looking at the deers running across the hills. And he spent a few years just healing, and it literally took a few years, but we know as well that was a privilege as well, that he got that job, and it was a wonderful gift to Dan in that sense, and not everybody gets that chance either.
No, and you're both great examples of coming through the crisis, your personal crisis. Thank you very much, Paula. Let's keep you there. Rachel is standing by as well. I'd like to introduce you now to our final guest, who's been waiting patiently to join us this evening. Reverend Nims Abungi MBE is the pastor of Freedom Ark Church and founder of the Peace Alliance. Nims, as you may or may know, is also standing in the postponed mayoral London mayor race. Nims, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Can I just start, before we go on to questions, to ask you what you have witnessed personally in North London in terms of the impact of this health emergency on the mental health and the poverty where you live and where you work?
Sorry, I forgot to unmute my mic. I do apologize, everybody.
It's happening at the government
Nina.
press conference every night. You're in good company. We can hear you now,
Okay,
Nims, loud and clear.
Okay, great, awesome. Thanks a lot, Nina. It's my office is in the Tottenham Town Hall, and we run a food bank and a food hub, and we also work with Christians Against Poverty. We have in excess of 1,200 to 300 people that come for our services. And that increased as a result of COVID. We started the food hub about a year ago and the food bank about 6 or 7 months ago. Now, what we realized is we have at least people who have come from analysis, 17 boroughs across London that come over here. They're African Caribbean, they're Romanian, their Spanglish actually comes here, and every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, we host at least a minimum of 120 people or thereabout, who we fortunately, through the support of the Felix Project, Morrison's, and a few other well-meaning members of our community, we're able to feed them. But I see the poverty, I see the hardship. In our questionnaire, we get to understand many of them have been furloughed. Some of them have not even been paid, even though they've been furloughed. We've had people who have no employment, or some already have they're in employment, but really they have so poor levels of pay, low level payments, and they're unable to sustain their families. We're seeing this trauma that is being replicated all across our community. And allow me to say something that I also feel concerned about, listening to some of the discussions that have already happened. I feel that I'm wary of us being a nation in denial. And when I say I don't want us to be a nation in denial, I heard, and I have the greatest respect for Sir Ian Duncan Smith, but I heard him say, "Oh, what's happening in America does not happen, is not happening here." I beg to differ that there are significant issues around justice and the way our young men feel traumatized. We're talking about mental health, traumatized around policing. You know, we can't shy away from the fact that the statistics speak so loudly that 4 in 1,000 white folks are likely to be stopped and searched, yet 38 in 1,000 black folks are likely to be stopped and searched. And what we found out during the COVID season, stop and search went up within the black and minority ethnic community by 9.6%. So there's this sense of trauma. Then you also find out that black and minority folks are more likely to be fined, 54% more likely to have a fixed penalty notice from the police. You would have heard of the case of Gershom Leach up in Manchester, a youth worker who was delivering food as an essential service, but then they find him, and if not for the pepper spray on, that they saw the threat on pepper spray by somebody videoing, he would have been that fixed penalty notice would have been placed on him. So when we talk about the trauma, there was a lot of fear. Mothers are scared about their children going out and the impact this could have. And I know we're in lockdown, but even when somebody's trying to, I had a member within our organization who was on the bus coming over here to serve. And unfortunately, what happened to her was she got stopped by the police. Now, fortunately, that situation was resolved, but I feel that there's a sense of fear, Nina. And I think you know the report that came out today. We have found out twice more likely to die as a result of COVID, and yet we don't know the causes, nor do we have recommendations. That's unacceptable. These are the kind of concerns we have in our community. These are the things that are impacting us.
Yeah, I think it's okay at this stage not to have the causes. It's a new virus. It's a very complicated picture to look at all the different factors. But I think a lot of people have been agreeing that it's shocking not to have any recommendations, because this health emergency is affecting people right now, and people of different ethnic minorities need to know what extra protection they should be taking and what jobs they should be doing, and whether they should be given extra financial support if it is deemed that they shouldn't be working right now, if they tick all of those factors, if they're older as well, if they're obese as well, if they're male as well. And we didn't get that today, which was a real shock, I think. A question come in from one of our viewers here tonight for NIMS. What are your thoughts regarding the looming mental health crisis facing the medical staff who've been on the coronavirus front line?
Here is one reality. I think that we have to make sure that there is a lot more support that is given to deal with the trauma and the mental support that medical. My brother works for the Red Cross. He's on the front line doing quite a lot of work. And I think we've got to try and make sure that on the one hand, you've got a strong family support system that is given to health workers. But at the same time, I think the government should be providing much greater support for them. And it is unfortunate. I don't see that happening the way it should. We have members within our church community who and I suppose we can offer at this point in time is the support that faith organizations, community organizations can give to health workers. But I think that goes back to government, unfortunately. And maybe, as you said earlier on, Boris is swamped, but there is a lot of fires he's trying to put out.
Yeah. On that issue of faith, NIMS, let's turn to Rachel. A question come in for you. What can the third faith sector do to help and prepare to help people with mental health issues?
Great question. I think the first thing is to get a level of training or insight, whether that's done through reading books, reading articles, doing kind of training on Zoom, whatever that is, but getting to grips with actually the reality of mental health for people and how that impacts their everyday life, and therefore how they can then help. So actually Perhaps it might be as simple as actually just asking people what can be done to help. Sometimes we can kind of rush in a little bit and say, oh, I'll do all these things for you. And actually we're taking away agency, and we're taking away perhaps the one thing they enjoy. So making an effort to say, would it be helpful if I pick the kids up from school, or would it be helpful for us to cook you a few meals? So making sure that people who need to be cared for are involved in it. But getting educated is really important, so that actually we know what we're facing.
Are we, Paula, under question to both of you, after Paula, are we facing the inevitability of a rising suicides if we see a recession, or can we talk now about trying to prevent suicides if there is a massive problem in terms of mental health and the financial impact on people?
I think it feels like an inevitability. However, now is the time to start talking about it and asking and getting people to actually act and to contact someone. There is a problem, as Rachel was saying earlier, in terms of access to mental health through the system. But certainly through, as far as financial poverty is concerned, that side of it is certainly solvable.
Nims, what's your answer to that? Is there a way that we can try to address that issue now before we see those statistics that people did take their own lives because of what they went through, however it impacted them, this health emergency?
No, I think that at this point in time, while we're dealing with this, massive poverty, we need to support our community much better. I've consistently believed that our family support network, I've consistently believed that, it's going to take that village effort. We've isolated for long enough, but I think we need to empower people to get on the phones, to engage with one another and support, because I think I don't really believe the government can do it on its own. And there is an increasing need from my experience. We don't get any government funding for the work we do at all. But what we've decided to do, we've had a whole range of volunteers, well-meaning people who are supporting address the crisis. And I think that just needs to happen. We've got to strengthen our community response.
Rachel.
Totally agree.
Oh, sorry, Paula, come in.
Oh no, I was literally going to say I totally agree with that. I think there's something very, very simple and yet extremely difficult that all of us can do, and that is deliberately steer away our thinking from me and mine. And even though we might all go through difficulties because of sort of post-COVID things, actually making a decision for generosity and actually opening your eyes to those around you will make a significant difference to those people. Acts of kindness. Shopping locally, even supporting your local stores, being socially aware, volunteering, those things actually will make a big difference.
Yeah, and it will help your own personal mental health and emotional well-being as well if you do that. Rachel, just a thought on the potential of a rise in suicides during this crisis.
I think one thing we really need to address is actually there is still a huge amount of stigma around suicide, and I think we need to keep pressing on about the language we use. We still use phrases like committed suicide, which are related to when it was a crime, a weird crime where you could only be prosecuted when you failed to do it, but a crime, and actually talk about it with compassion, allow people to voice their despair. And it's hard work and it's difficult, but actually it's really important that we're able to ask people about suicide and to listen to what they have to say, as well as having an awareness of the different avenues that they can access further support.
One of the viewers has asked, we are all affected by mental health, but why is there still so much stigma in general, I guess, not just in terms of talking about suicide?
And I think it is because you can't see it. And I think actually that is not restricted to mental health. I know there are a lot of I guess so-called invisible illnesses, which people find it hard to believe in. People find it hard to believe, that ME exists because you can't see it. There's no visible sign. And I also think, again, coming back to the language thing, that we use words like anxiety and depression so often that actually understanding the reality of living with an anxiety disorder or clinical depression feels quite removed, because we can only think of it in terms of, well, I felt down, I felt anxious, and I'm all right. Whereas actually not understanding that just because we might have felt anxiety or felt depression at some point, it's a huge world away from the reality of living with mental illness.
Nims, how concerned are you that during this crisis, we've had up to 60,000 deaths in this country? People haven't been able to grieve properly. They've not had funerals as we know them. Even in war times, you could have a physical hug with somebody that was close to you. The people that we've mentioned earlier who've had to say goodbye to relatives via FaceTime that weren't there at their bedside. How much of an impact is that going to have on anybody who's lost somebody during this period? And also the fact that they've gone through a very personal death at a time of collective death, does that also make it harder?
It's interesting to say that the chief executive of the Peace Alliance, for which I'm the chair of the Peace Alliance, for which I'm the chief executive, he passed on the 28th of March, and as a result of COVID, and his daughter called me, and I realized, I broke down, because he was my mentor, it was my father figure, and we were so close. So it was one of those moments where I realized that, this had come home to roost. It was very personal to me, and I found that happen with other members of communities or individuals that I know. It's so difficult to grieve and say, this happened to me, when someone else is saying it also happened to me, and it also happened to me, and it's happening. And people try to say, get over it. So I think that what we have right now is we have a collective trauma within our society. And I think there's so much trauma, and we're not able to find a way to manage it at this moment. And, whilst we're saying when it's over, we don't even know when it's going to be over. So I don't know that we are prepared. We know how to manage this. I think we're going to have to, this is going to take a while for all of us within the Black and minority ethnic communities, where we're twice more likely to die. And this impact is, I suppose, that impacting all communities. But I think everybody is going to have to find ways in this moment in time and try to provide that support structure. We all have a responsibility to care for the other and be our brother's keeper. I think I reminder of the Maasai culture. They will say something like "Kasera Ngira," how are the children? It's a greeting that basically says, how are you? How are you getting along? What is it like in your community? And I think we generally need to respond to that. How are you? How are the children? How are you coping? We need to ask those questions.
Yeah. Nims, I'm very sorry for your loss. We are running out of time. Just before we say goodbye, if I could ask each of you just tell me something positive that you've experienced out of being in lockdown. Rachel, if I can start with you.
I think just a bit more time with family. We've got an 18-month-old. So yeah, just him being himself really has been quite fun. Yeah.
Yeah, precious times, definitely. Nims, what about yourself?
I think I've just seen the great spirit within our community, the volunteering that has happened, the thousands or hundreds of people we're able to support. I'm grateful for that, and seeing how we are feeding families, seeing the smiles, the tears, and knowing that we're doing something significant. That is so special.
Yeah, the smiles mean a bit more at the moment, don't they? And finally, Paula.
They've pinched my answers. No, both of those things. I'm loving. Christians Against Poverty is in Bradford, so it's usually a 3-hour round trip. So I'm really enjoying not driving for 3 hours every day. But I think really that the biggest thing is around the community spirit and the fact that people just genuinely are waving and smiling. And I've had conversations, socially distanced conversations, obviously, with people that I live near and I've never even spoke to, because it's a different time. Everything is slightly slowed. Not when you're working, but when you're out there, and that's been beautiful.
Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm now going to hand you back to Patrick Regan, the OBE co-founder and CEO of Kintsugi Hope, and founder, as Ian Duncan Smith mentioned earlier, of the youth work charity XLP. Patrick.
Thanks, Nina. That was absolutely fascinating debate. You know, we have heard a lot of statistics about poverty and about mental health. We have to remember that every statistic is alive. Every statistic is a person going through something really, really challenging. My boss, Simon Barrington, who is the chair of Kintsugi Hope and the director of Forged Leadership, he talks about 3 phases. He put his brilliant video up on YouTube, which looks at the phases that emergency relief operations look at when there's been a natural disaster. Phase 1 is he calls emergency response, and this is where people are running hard. There's often characterised by burnout. You know, we're trying to make sure that we've got enough food. We're trying to care for our families. If you're in a charity or an organisation, you're trying to pivot, so you're all going online so the charity can survive. And there's that sense of the adrenaline is really going. The second phase is called recovery. And that can last from 6 months to 12 months, probably longer in the case of COVID-19. And that is where we're going to see a tsunami of mental health issues, anxiety. People are going to be scared of going out. And all the experts are saying, you know, it's when lockdown is eased, that's when the challenges are really, really going to come. And so if we know that's coming, we need to get ready now. We need to get trained up in emotional and mental health to really understand it and how to fight poverty in the grassroots. It's going to be a phase that is characterised by memorial services. Think about it. You know, only 4 or 5 people can go to a funeral. We're going to want to remember our loved ones in a really, really special way. We're going to have to allow people to lament, to grieve. It's really, really important for people to go through that process. And then the third one they describe as reconstruction. And I think this is about asking ourselves, what type of society do we want to be? What are our values? Values inform behaviour. I'm sure that the values of health and relationships and family and fairness and justice and community are going to be so important. And it's interesting to me that people that we described as low-skilled workers in a week became our key workers, became absolutely pivotal for us getting through this. We need to honour people. We need to pay them what they're worth. Jacqueline Novgratz is an American entrepreneur. She's done some amazing work at looking at entrepreneurial ways of dealing with poverty. She came up with this quote, which I think is so, so true. She says this: the coronavirus has laid bare the gaping wounds of our society that has grown too individualistic over the last 30 to 50 years and reinforced our interdependence in the most profound ways. She goes on to say that the current situation has given us a chance to rethink and rebuild society from a new moral framework, placing humanity and community at the centre, focusing more on helping the poor and the vulnerable and engaging more in collaboration instead of competition is how our post-COVID-19 society will succeed. Interdependence. We need to rely on each other. We need to be laying down ego and brands and individualism, working together. We've always been interconnected. There's more phones than people on the planet. But interdependence is different. It means we've got to work together like we've never worked together before. I believe we need to challenge our education system. Many of us feel like we need to see a rebalancing in our education system so it promotes well-being and life skills as much as it does academic achievement. We want to put people before programs. We want to put learning before statistics, character before charisma, kindness before achievement. Looking at this and listening to everything that's been said, we need free responses. We do need a government response. We need the government to do the right thing. We need governments actually to work cross-party. Rather than shout at each other in the House of Commons, we need them to find common ground, to work together for the common good. We need to ask political parties to put people affected by poverty first. You know, policy that is purely decided by people in Westminster is always bad policy. policy that's informed by the grassroots, people living in communities. Their voices need to be heard. And bringing that together with the policy world of Westminster is the only way to go. We've got to have collaboration. Every poverty fighting organisation I know at the moment is really crying out for two key things. Increase housing benefit so it meets the cost of average rent across the country. We need to lift the benefit cap to ensure everyone can have access to the support that they need. We need governments to do the right thing. We need a community response. There have been so many acts of love and kindness and commitment. And we know that history shows us that it's not often governments that create change. It's social movements that change the world. And you may say, Patrick, you are very moralistic and a bit of a dreamer, but I don't mind being that, because I want to reimagine a society that puts the people on the margins at the forefront. Charities, churches, faith groups, people have been volunteering, the cat workers, the food banks. Thank you so much for everything you do. I'm guessing that if you're one of those people watching this tonight, you are passionate, but you're knackered. But please keep showing up. My very precious friend who's worked with homeless people for most of her life says this, Deb Richardson Moore, where does the love come in? I think it's this. Showing up day after day after day, putting one foot in front of the other and slogging it out. It's not glamorous sometimes. Please keep going and take care of yourself at the same time. We also need an individual response. I hope that this period will make us less judgmental as a nation. And we need to work out what can we do. The fascinating thing about the cat video, Tina talking about her situation, is that she said the cat worker rung her up and she was on the phone for 5 minutes, and she said that 5-minute phone call set me up for the whole week. Who could you phone for 5 minutes? Who could you reach out to? In conclusion, there are no quick fixes. We need a long-term strategy. We need charity that is based on long-term relationships, which has the potential to do more harm than good. We need a real understanding of what the word dignity means in the way that we treat our workers and those who feel marginalised in a society. Robert Lupton wrote a brilliant book called Toxic Charity, and it's some book that's informed so much of my thinking. And throughout the book, he looks at the difference between justice and mercy. I've worked in some of the poorest communities around the world, and he talks about, and I totally agree with him, you know, I've met with homeless people, with addicts, with street children, and I've tried to show them love and taken them on trips. I remember in Hong Kong going with a bunch of addicts every day on these bike trips. It was fantastic. Working with young people in the schools in Trenchtown and in London. But I noticed that they became young men, and actually the need then for immediate cash takes priority over school attendance and trips out. You see, mercy compels us to show acts of compassion, but at some point it will collide with justice. You see, what good is a sandwich, he says, when a severe addiction has taken control of a man's life? Or a night shelter when a young girl must sell her body to feed her child? The ancient prophet Micah said this, act justly, love mercy, walk humbly with your God. We can't divide these three things in my book. Justice is fairness in the way that people are treated and respected and decisions are made. Mercy is compassion, kindness or forgiveness shown to someone whom a person has power over. Lupton says this, mercy without justice degenerates into dependency and entitlement, preserving the power of the giver over the recipient. Justice without mercy is cold and impersonal, more consumed about rights than relationship. The addict needs both food and treatment. The young woman needs both a safe place to sleep and a way out of entrapping lifestyle. Street kids need both friendships and jobs. There's an illustration in the book, and you all would have heard of it before. Feed a man a fish and he'll eat for a day. Teach a man to fish and he'll eat for a lifetime. It's conventional wisdom, right? But he says, what happens if the fish had disappeared from the lake due to pollution or overfishing? We need to change the strategy. How do we control the lake, stop the pollution, issue fishing license, put wildlife management policies in place, teach a man to fish as an individual matter? But gaining control of the lake is a community issue. It is not inevitable that these things have to be so heartbreaking. You know, in 2008, when the recession hit, suicides went up, and obviously poverty was horrific. And most people say we're going to go into another recession, and that's obviously going to happen. But we could do the right things now to prevent people from thinking of completing suicides. We could do the right things now to do with issues of poverty. I firmly believe that beauty can come out of brokenness. That's why I think the Kintsugi image is so powerful. You know what? Margaret Mead says this: never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that has. I want to thank you for listening. We're going to show you a quick clip now, and this is around how do you care for your own emotional, mental well-being. There may be people watching this going, I'm struggling, what do I do? There are lots of helplines on the description in the YouTube description, but please watch this, and then I've got something else I want to say for about 30 seconds, then we're done. Thank you.
Guys, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been such an amazing to have our guests on. I want to say a massive thank you to Paula, to Nims, to Rachel, to Ian, and for Nina for hosting us so brilliantly. And it's been such a privilege to work with these guys. I also want to thank the people behind the scenes, Alex and Jess. Often they're the people that work the hardest and don't get thanks. So I'm really grateful for my team. I mean, it's volunteering week, and I know there'll be so many of you that volunteered for CAP. I know there are loads of Kintsugi Hope well-being leaders watching because you keep Facebooking me. Thank you for everything you do. I appreciate it so much. So please stay in touch. Remember Rachel's book, my book, the resources. I hope you don't mind. I was reading this today. I wanted to leave us with a benediction, and I am a man of faith, and I actually think this is some of the most beautiful words that I've read, and I've often read this, but I want to leave you with this because I think it's powerful. It says this: may God bless you with a restless discomfort about easy answers, half-truths, and superficial relationships, so that you may seek truth boldly and love deeply within your heart. May God bless you with holy anger at injustice, oppression, and the exploitation of people, so that you may work tirelessly for justice, freedom, and peace amongst all peoples. May God bless you with the gift of tears, to shed for those who suffer from pain, rejection, starvation, or the loss of all that they cherish, so they may reach out your hand to comfort them and transform their pain into joy. May God bless you with enough foolishness to believe that you can make a difference in this world, so that you are able, with God's grace, to do what others claim cannot be done. And may the grace and may the peace and the grace of our Lord and our Savior Jesus Christ to be with you and remain with you from this day and forevermore. Amen. May God bless you. Thank you so much for joining. It's been a privilege to share this time with you. Goodbye.